everyone, and welcome to English Speaking Hub, the podcast where we help you build real, natural English speaking skills, one episode at a time. Today I'm talking about something almost every learner deals with at some point: the fear of speaking English out loud. Maybe you know all the grammar rules. Maybe your vocabulary is actually pretty strong, but the moment someone expects you to speak, your mind goes blank, your heart starts beating a little faster, and you freeze. If that sounds familiar, this episode is for you. Part 1. Why speaking feels so much scarier than reading or writing. Let's start by understanding why speaking specifically feels so much harder than reading or writing, even for learners who are genuinely quite advanced. When you're reading, you can take as much time as you need. When you're writing, you can pause, think, delete a sentence, and rewrite it as many times as you want. But speaking happens in real time. There's no delete button. There's no pause button while a real person is standing in front of you waiting for your answer. This creates something researchers sometimes call performance pressure. Your brain isn't just trying to produce correct English. It's also trying to manage a live social situation. Read the other person's reactions, and think of your response all at the same time. That's an enormous amount of mental work happening simultaneously. On top of that, a lot of learners carry a deep fear of judgment. There's a common, very human worry that if you make a mistake, the other person will think less of you, or laugh, or assume you're not intelligent simply because your English isn't perfect. Here's the important thing to understand, though. This fear is almost always much bigger in your own mind than it is in reality. Most native speakers, and most other learners too, are far more forgiving of small mistakes than we assume. In fact, most people are simply happy that a real conversation is happening at all. Part 2. The perfectionism trap. Let's talk about a specific pattern that makes this fear even worse: perfectionism. A lot of learners believe, somewhere deep down, that they need to speak in complete, grammatically perfect sentences before they're ready to actually talk to someone. So they wait. They study more grammar. They review more vocabulary. They tell themselves, I'll start speaking once I'm a little better. But here's the problem with that approach. Speaking skill isn't built by waiting until you're ready. It's built by actually speaking, imperfectly, over and over again, until it gradually becomes more comfortable and more natural. Think about it this way. Nobody learns to ride a bicycle by reading about bicycles for months and months before ever getting on one. You learn by getting on the bicycle, wobbling around a little, maybe falling once or twice, and slowly building your balance through direct practice. Speaking a language works exactly the same way. The wobbling, the small mistakes, the awkward pauses, these aren't signs that you're failing. They're simply a normal, necessary part of the actual learning process. There's also a really useful mindset shift here. Instead of asking yourself, how can I avoid making mistakes? Try asking, how can I communicate my basic idea, even with some mistakes? That single shift in thinking takes an enormous amount of pressure off every single conversation. Part 3. Practical ways to reduce speaking anxiety. All right, let's move into some practical strategies you can actually use to reduce this fear over time. First, start with extremely low-pressure speaking situations. This might mean talking to yourself out loud at home, describing your day, your plans, or things around your room. It might feel strange at first, but it's a completely judgment-free way to build the physical habit of speaking English regularly. Second, try speaking with people who are also learners, not just native speakers. A lot of learners assume they should only practice with native speakers. But honestly, practicing with another learner can feel much less intimidating, since you both understand exactly what it feels like to make mistakes. Third, Prepare a few simple phrases in advance for common, predictable situations. For example, having a ready phrase like, "Sorry, could you say that again a little slower?" Or, "I'm still learning, so please be patient with me," can genuinely reduce anxiety because you're not caught completely off guard. Fourth, focus on one small conversation goal at a time instead of trying to sound perfect overall. For example, your goal for one specific conversation might simply be, "I will ask at least 2 questions," rather than, "I will speak with 0 mistakes." Small, specific goals feel much more achievable than a vague goal like "sound fluent." Fifth, and this one is really important, celebrate the attempt, not just the result. If you tried to speak, even if the conversation felt awkward or you made several mistakes, that attempt itself is a genuine success. Progress in speaking comes from repeated attempts, not from any single perfect performance. Part 4. Reframing mistakes as useful information. Let's talk about mistakes themselves for a moment, because I think reframing how we view them can make a huge difference. A mistake in speaking isn't really a failure, it's actually useful information. It shows you exactly which specific pattern, word, or grammar point still needs a little more practice. In that sense, every mistake is genuinely a small, useful signal pointing you toward what to focus on next. Here's another helpful way to think about it. Even native speakers make mistakes constantly in casual everyday speech. They pause, they say and they restart sentences halfway through, they use the wrong words sometimes and correct themselves. Natural human speech in any language is full of small imperfections. It's simply not something most people notice or judge as harshly as learners often assume. I also want to mention something specific: the difference between a mistake that blocks understanding and a mistake that doesn't. Many grammar mistakes, like using the wrong verb tense or forgetting an article like a or the, don't actually prevent the other person from understanding your basic meaning at all. Those small mistakes are honestly not worth stressing over nearly as much as learners often do. Part 5. A personal story about facing the fear. Let me share a story that I think really captures this whole topic. Years ago, I worked with a student who was incredibly intelligent, and honestly, his written English was excellent. But in speaking practice, he would often go completely silent, clearly terrified of making a mistake in front of me. One day, instead of correcting every small error, I simply asked him to talk for 2 full minutes about his weekend, and I told him clearly I wasn't going to correct anything at all during those 2 minutes. My only job was to listen and understand. At first, he was hesitant, and there were several long pauses. But slowly, he started talking more freely, making plenty of small mistakes along the way, but also communicating clearly and confidently. By the end of those 2 minutes, he looked genuinely surprised at himself. He told me afterward that removing the fear of being corrected in that exact moment made speaking feel completely different, lighter somehow, and much less stressful. We continued practicing that way regularly, focusing on communication first and correction only afterward in a separate, calmer part of our lesson. Over the following months, his speaking confidence grew enormously. Not because his grammar suddenly became perfect, but because he had genuinely gotten more comfortable with the process of simply speaking, mistakes and all. Quick listening check. Before we wrap up, let's do a quick listening check together. Question 1. What did we call the mental pressure of managing a live social situation while also trying to speak correctly? Performance pressure. Question 2. According to this episode, what's a more useful question to ask yourself instead of, "How can I avoid making mistakes?" How can I communicate my basic idea even with some mistakes? Question 3. In the personal story, what specific instruction did the host give her student for those 2 minutes of speaking practice? She told him she wouldn't correct anything at all during those 2 minutes. She would only listen. Great job if you remembered all three. That's all for today's episode of English Speaking Hub. We talked about why speaking feels scarier than reading or writing, the perfectionism trap, practical ways to reduce speaking anxiety, reframing mistakes as useful information, and a personal story about facing that fear directly. If you take just one thing away from today, let it be this: speaking imperfectly again and again is exactly how fluency is actually built. There's no shortcut around that process, but there is comfort in knowing that every single fluent speaker went through this exact same stage. Thanks so much for listening, everyone. See you in the next episode of English Speaking Hub. Bye for now.